Hello out there! Welcome, welcome, welcome. Looks like we already have quite a few people on board from all around. Um, I'm here with Gareth today, who apparently is out in outer space, so that's awesome.
Hello, hello.
We're going to be continuing our discussion from last week that I actually, unfortunately, wasn't able to be a part of. So I'm excited to get involved in a story structure conversation because I'm a huge fan of talking about story structure. It's probably because I tend to be hyper analytical. But it's fun to take stories that we already know and kind of look underneath the hood, see what's making them tick. It can tell us a little bit of why they are so successful. And as an artist, it doesn't mean you necessarily go through and you copy beat for beat the exact way that they're getting those, emotional linchpins out of the way, but it can certainly give you some insight as to how to affect an audience, how to move an audience, how to pull a protagonist through a journey, all of that great stuff. And I know Gareth and Catherine did an excellent job talking about that last week. So we're just going to keep things rolling with some more examples. And what we would like from you are maybe some examples as well. If there's a story that you really like that you'd like to talk about, maybe there's a story that you really like that you can tell there's a structure there, but it maybe seems a more abstract than what we're talking about. Sometimes I find with more abstract stories, there's actually more structure underneath and may meet the eye because it's maybe more subtly done. So, anyway, like I said, I have Gareth here. We're going to be talking about. I have a couple of examples here. Excuse me, of different movies and stories to talk about. But like I said, any stories you'd like to talk about, just let us know. So where's
Yeah, try
everybody
try
gone?
laying them out in the comments as we go, kind of like we did last
Hmm.
week with each beat, where you
Sounds
think
good.
or what you think the event in the story is that matches that part. It can be quite challenging, as Daniel said. Sometimes, not every story will map one to one onto every given kind of structural framework, so it can be sometimes tough to figure out. Okay, what specific beat would come here, but it's still much worth doing because as you map it out, it can make it clearer in your mind. It's like, oh yeah, I never thought of this part of the story being this functional.
Hmm. It's so true. It was something that I actually discovered when preparing for this broadcast because I was going through. I tried to pick examples from different genres, and one of the examples I have is actually a romance, which surprisingly enough still fits in very well with all these beats, but not in the same way that like an action adventure movie does. So it's fun. It's fun to look at that and look at mechanically what's going on. All right, so we got Hawaii, Palm Desert, Michigan, UK, East Tennessee, Pennsylvania, Tampa, Vermont, California, Ontario, Wisconsin, Birmingham, Ohio, Kentucky. Awesome. Fantastic. Baltimore. All right. So all over. So without further ado, I want to go ahead and start with a story. I almost want to like say like what you pick, but I'll just go ahead. I got a few here. All right, and I have my little cheat sheet here, so we're gonna kind of go as we go. We'll progress through these story points. All right, so the first one I want to bring up is the archetypical hero journey story, really, and that's Star Wars: A New Hope. It's a pretty obvious example, and the reason why I like to get it out of the way early is just because it is a good archetypical hero's journey. George Lucas was heavily influenced by the work of Campbell and others who studied myth, so it has that easy to identify structure. So, at the beginning of the story, our main character, who is Luke Skywalker, he's not the viewpoint character at the beginning because there's like a little prologue before you get to him just to keep things exciting and to show the looming threat. But we begin with Luke Skywalker as the poor farmer in the middle of nowhere that nobody really cares about, which is just the classic starting point of a hero character, that humble rags to riches origin story. which, nothing wrong with something like that. It's classic. Just, as you go through tropes, you always have to realize they're tropes. So may want to mess with them a little bit, tweak them a little bit, but they serve a purpose. All right. So we have the inciting incident. I'm just to see if Gareth agrees with me on all my points. You can get debatable. You can get debated on this. I would say the inciting incident for Luke Skywalker is getting the message from Princess Leia, because that is really his beckoning to get involved in something bigger than himself. And so he goes off looking for Obi-Wan Kenobi. So,
Yes, I would agree. I
and
think
then,
the inciting incident is always worth thinking about. It's not necessarily something big and bombastic, but it's whatever happens that changes the world, changes that status quo for the main character. And of course, in the case of Star Wars, it's coming across the droids.
yes. And then ultimately he meets up with Obi-Wan. Obi-Wan tells him about the Jedi and the Force, and get involved with things. And ultimately Luke says, no, you do have a very clear refusal of the call. He's like, no, I can't really leave my family behind. It's not something I'm really going to do. Now, some people criticize stories like Star Wars for having a protagonist that kind of gets arm twisted into going on the adventure, because ultimately Luke's aunt and uncle get obliterated, which is part of the transition to Act Two. But I mean, I don't really I don't really agree with that. I think there's a lot of really great stories where the protagonist is kind of arm twisted into it. I don't think it's necessary. I think people do tend to like to read about empowered protagonists. I think when people will criticize reluctant heroes, what they're really getting at is once you get beyond that, their arm is twisted, they still don't really want to go on the adventure. Like they just get dragged through the whole story, and that gets aggravating. Because you don't want to hear a story where it's just like somebody who doesn't want to be involved is getting pulled through. Unless it's like comedic. I think of like Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which basically is kind of like that. The guy just gets kind of pulled through. But I would say if you're not doing that, that doesn't work very well. What do you
Yeah,
think, Gareth?
I think that's a great point. Um, I have absolutely no problem with them kind of being forced into it because a lot of the times in stories, especially at epic scale kind of things, it's perfectly natural and understandable to have the character go, "No, I really don't want any involvement in this. It's too
Right.
much of a shakeup." And when you do something, for example, in Star Wars here, the obliteration. I can't remember the characters' names now of those two. Is kind
Uncle
of
Owen and Aunt Beru?
that's it. And is Luke literally being kicked through the doorway into
Yeah,
Act
pretty
Two?
much. I mean, he
And
has nothing left at that point.
yeah, doing that as well in this kind of manner, it drives home very, very early the ruthlessness of the antagonist, that they're
Hmm.
willing to do something like this. And of course, that's
Hmm.
the arm twist for the main character as well. I got to deal with this. But I think Daniel's correct there. There's at some point in the story where they have to become more active. Unless, of course, you are going for that comedic, almost anti hero kind of thing where they're just like, oh, what's next? I know I'm not even supposed to be here. That can be very, very funny. But you really only play along with that if that's what you're going for. Otherwise, they're going to be a very annoying hero.
Yeah, somebody is asking, if he belongs to somebody called Ben Kenobi. Is that the inciting? I think that's all part of that. It's not just one moment, right? It's all part of that looking for Obi-Wan and all of that. Because you could even include meeting Obi-Wan and Obi-Wan explaining to him about the Force, about his father and all that as kind of part of that package, right? Because that's going to be the inciting incident is what causes the character to start debating how they're going to get involved in the story. So it could be that they observe something, something happens to them. So it's not just one thing. It's a series of things. Lots of good stories where there's no choice going back to change. Yes, that's true. That really does raise the stakes, right? It makes it to where forcing the protagonist into it. Works well for raising the stakes right off the get go, because it's like, well, they don't have anything left, so they've got to win because that's their only option now at this point, for sure. All right, so we got the obstacle encounter, which, the main antagonist of this story is the Empire itself. And so there's battles. They start to encounter them. The transition act 2 really is getting off of the planet. It's they're off into space, and then they encounter them, and then they have to go into hyperspace, and then they start going into the Death Star, and then I would say the escalation comes where they realize, whoa, this is like a much worse situation than we thought. The princess is in this ginormous space station that's the size of a moon. Crazy. Like it just gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then they're docking, and the plan just seems to get worse. They have to split up, things like that. I would say the midpoint is after they've gotten Princess Leia, because that's really when it turns from being a rescue to a, all right, now we're going to be starting to fight back, and things like that. It's really the pivot point of the story. Gareth can interrupt me at any time if he disagrees with what I'm saying.
Well,
So.
I think so. And often, depending on the setup of your story, yeah, the midpoint can be that spot where the rules change, that pivot
Hmm.
happens, and they're like, okay, well, now I'm going to take you down to the antagonist.
Yeah.
Goes along the lines of kind of what Monica was asking there about horror, where they're forced to be the hero or survivor.
That's right.
Yeah, absolutely. You always just want to have that point where it's take it to him. The hero's going
Yeah.
to fight back.
Right. Yeah. Horror is often a reluctant hero, right? Because most of the time people don't consciously choose to put themselves in a horrific situation. They often find themselves in the horrific situation, by accident or foolhardiness or something like that, for
Correct,
sure.
and I think that's why the refusal of the call works so well there too, and it's not passive because often in horror that's trying to extricate yourself from the situation.
Yep.
They find themselves in some deadly situation, something really awful is happening, and they say, "No, I need to get out of here," and
Hmm.
that's when in horror they receive a very clear message that you cannot get out of here. So they're forced into the whole situation, but as we said, kind of eventually they're going to fight back.
Yep. And often the midpoint in horror is when the characters decide to be proactive rather than reactive, at least from my experience. Um, they start to learn enough about whatever is affecting them that they can start to respond, things like that.
Yeah,
It's
they're
where,
they're able to kind of shift the momentum in their
yeah,
favor.
yeah. And then we have the obstacle encounter escalation. At this point, the Empire has killed Obi-Wan, who was Luke's mentor, the guardian force of the story. And so that's a big crutch kicked out of him. And they're following them to the base, and the Death Star is approaching on the base, which creates the big final crisis, which is, well, the Death Star is going to blow up the base. Which is the last hope that the Rebel Alliance will be successful. And so will essentially be a complete failure for Luke personally. Um, and also at this point, you have Luke himself escalating to the point where he is alone in the trench with Darth Vader right on his heels, and he's just about to shoot him. So it's like his back is against the wall. What is possibly going to happen to get him out of this mess? Like, he's going to die, all his friends are going to die. Like, ultimate failure, right?
And
All
the
right,
answer
so
is
we
use the force.
what'd you say?
So the answer to it is use the force, Luke.
The answer to it is use the force. Yes, and with the help of Han Solo a little bit as well, and Obi-Wan. Yeah, so he gets help from some friends, but ultimately, yes, he has to do it. He is a proactive character. He has to trust in the force. We had a few fails along the way where he was kind of trying to use the force and not doing a terrific job of it, so it feels earned. We have the big climax where Darth Vader is taken out and the Death Star is blown up, which is the big symbol of the Empire for the film. Uh, Resolution. This happens really quick, which is not uncommon for especially more of an action type story where this just rivets. This goes really quickly. The resolution. Han Solo and Luke shake hands. Yeah, that's 1 in a million. Han Solo now respects Luke So you have that reconciliation. You have the reconciliation of Obi-Wan and Luke, because Obi-Wan's like, the Force will be with you always, and that's all leading right into the denouement, which is the big throne scene where you get to see now they are celebrated heroes in this universe. And Luke has gone from his humble beginnings as a farmer to perhaps the most important person in the entire universe. Quite a lot for what, 2 hours? It's quite a journey. But it is amazing though how believable that is to the audience because of the way it's pulling those steps. Because if you think about Star Wars in terms of the amount of time it is, even that it's not picturing a whole lot of time. Like, what would it be like? A couple days, if that? Like, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how long it is after they get to the base for the Death Star to find them, but I can't imagine it's that long. So it's a very short period of time, but yet you have this tremendous growth. But it doesn't feel to me, it doesn't feel cheap at all. It feels very earned. It feels like you did go on this epic adventure for sure. So something to keep in mind. I think sometimes writers worry. They're like, "Oh, well, if everything unfolds really fast in the book, isn't that just going to seem really cheap?" I think it really depends on the execution. I don't think you necessarily have to have the person training for months and months and months, even if that's realistic, because it's just not how our story brain works. Like, we just suspend that. We're like, "Okay, cool. He's the black belt in 24 hours. All right." you know, like, it depends on the story, of course.
Yeah, it's like it's visually easier in film, obviously, because you get the benefit of the montage, where you can rocket through a whole lot of time in a few
Yeah.
simple shots, but not so easy in a novel.
Mm-mm. Right. And sometimes delaying for that growth is just it's almost like a video game where you're just making the character level up and you have to do all that silly boring stuff that you don't really care about. Or it can also make the antagonist not seem very threatening, because it's like, oh, they just sat on their hands for 5 months so that the main character could level up. That seems a little convenient too. So you could be substituting one problem for another problem. Just keep that in mind with your pacing. All right, so let's talk about another film. This is Disney's Aladdin, which is a different sort of hero journey. It's a much more, I don't know, internal character growth sort of journey. So we begin and we meet our main character, Aladdin, who is somebody who has to steal to eat, and he sings his fun loving song about it. But you can tell deep down he's actually a wounded soul who just wishes he could be respected by anybody. So we have the inciting incident, which is the princess comes into the marketplace and then they meet, and then he gets in trouble for being with the princess and he gets kidnapped, and he gets sent into an adventure. Now, in terms of refusal of the call, Aladdin doesn't really have much of a choice to get involved exactly, because he's kidnapped and then he's in the dungeon and Jafar has found him and he's like, "Well, this is the way I can help you get out if you just make this deal with me." But what the film does do is it shows a little bit of apprehension from Aladdin in terms of, well, like, why are you even doing this? Is this even a good idea? Is this safe? So even though it's not like a hard no, you definitely get a sense of the weight of what is going on. And obviously, what Jafar is asking Aladdin to do is step into a giant lion shaped cave in the middle of the desert, which doesn't look particularly safe. So we have a sense that this is a big adventure that Aladdin's having to go on, which is the purpose of refusal of the calls, to give that weight to the stakes of the rest of the story, right? All right, so we end up going into the transition to Act Two, which is the genie. And it was actually a major problem they had when developing this movie, was that they knew they really couldn't get to genie until Act Two, so they would keep cutting things in the beginning. And if you watch like the making of, there was a lot more they wanted to do with Aladdin. He had a mother, he had friends, and they just realized that all of that stuff had to be cut because they had to get to the genie, the big comedic relief, and he was going to be a big energetic force of the story, and a fun character, and they just did not want to delay that. So pacing wise, it gets to Act Two rather quick. Um, and the genie ends up getting him out of the cave. He ends up tricking him. Now, the obstacle that Aladdin is going to encounter is ultimately uh, he's driven by wanting to fall in love with the princess, or particularly the princess fall in love with him for them to get together. But the problem is that the princess can only marry a prince. So he asks the genie to make him into a prince. And immediately upon arrival, Jafar starts wondering what's going on with you? Like, are you really a prince? He's very suspicious. So that's that obstacle. It's, it's not a major fight because, this is a little bit of a different story, but it's still following the pattern. He's seeing that antagonist. The antagonist is onto him, but not quite yet. And then there's an escalation, which is that in order for Aladdin to keep up this ruse, he has to tell lie upon lie upon lie. You have Jasmine wondering what's up with him, and he's having to lie to her, and all of his friends are telling him that he needs to tell the truth, and he doesn't want to. So it's just getting him more and more into the muck, and it's not looking very good for him. So you get to that midpoint where he starts out as driven by his love for Jasmine. And the first initial reaction to Genie when he's like, "Oh, I'd love to be free." Aladdin's like, "Oh yeah, I'll free you. It's no big deal." But now he's like changed. He has decided, nope, he's going to stay dishonest, and he's going to keep Genie under his control just so that he can ensure that he ends up with Jasmine. So it's not too great, not too great. But of course there's consequences to that, because the big escalation towards the end is that Jafar steals the genie's lamp, and this creates a major crisis. Aladdin is sent to the ends of the earth, not to mention I'm going like ghostly. Not to mention, Jasmine is aware now that he was being completely dishonest to him. So in a sense, he's really lost everything. He's at the ends of the earth. The kingdom has been taken over by the bad guy. Jasmine doesn't like him anymore potentially. So pretty much ultimate failure. But he goes back. He has a big fight with Jafar, and ultimately, what his big fight with Jafar is a game of wits, where he convinces Jafar that in order to have ultimate control, he needs to be a genie himself. It's kind of, goes back to Aladdin's problem with control in terms of lying, if you want to get philosophical about it. So then we end up with a resolution where Aladdin and Jasmine can get married because the Sultan can change the law, which kind of a convenient way of settling that, but it's a family film. Ultimately, I don't think it feels as cheap because Aladdin did have to come to grips with his dishonesty, and he did beat Jafar in a pretty snazzy game of wits. So the fact that this extra bit, which was the driving force for the beginning of the story, ends up getting resolved rather conveniently. Not the end of the world. And then we have the denouement where the genie is freed. Again, going back to that thematic element of freedom and choice, and the genie runs off, and it's a beautiful ending. So you can see how it still hits those beats, but in a very different way than Star Wars.
And not to mention, so much singing.
So much singing. I'm a huge fan of musicals. I've actually written musicals, so you're not going to get any complaints with me about musicals. But I promise I will not sing anything. Not to mention, I don't want YouTube to take us down for copyright infringement. Although, if I could match it well enough that their algorithm could pick it up, I would be very impressed with myself. That would be a really great win. But like I said, I think it's important when you look at structures like this is you allow yourself a little bit of play in terms of how you hit those beats, because there's multiple ways you can hit the same sort of you can hit that rhythm. It's not I think sometimes people will look at structure like this and they'll feel it's much more rigid than it actually is. You have to think of it more abstract and at a much higher level, um, for it to really fit in with uh, stories across the board. In like its
Yeah, it's
absolute
handy for
form, it's kind of
planning, but
basically the hero's journey.
Yeah, it's a simple kind of breakdown of the hero's journey in most cases, but you do, yeah, when planning or trying to make sure that the structure of your story has those core beats and is making sense, is make sure to leave the boxes open a little. it's not a, it's not
Yeah,
such a closed, rigid thing. If you try to stay too
no.
rigid, it's not going to fit every story.
And I will say also for a vast majority of writers who are discovery writers, pantsers, whatever, or however the term you want to use, this is something you really are going to do after you do a first draft. You're going to, you're going to start with your premise, you're going to pants it, you're going to have all that fun, and then at the end of it, this is a great way to kind of diagnose your story to see. Where some of the shortcomings of the structure might be, whether or not you're hitting it hard enough, because sometimes you just don't realize the purpose of the scene. You just did it instinctively because we've seen all of these stories, right? And it's like a part of our DNA to just to spit out this stuff. And then we don't realize, oh, well, the reason why I wanted this conversation was to show the audience the gravity of the situation. And then you can look at that scene and you can ask yourself, is that scene really accomplishing that at the best level it can? Or because that wasn't in the back of your mind when you were writing it, which fair enough, but because it wasn't in the back of your mind or writing it, did you maybe not hit that quite as strongly as you could have?
Yeah, there's one I think would be interesting. I'll take a walk through a story here that I think um,
Ooh,
gives a little bit of a different perspective on this, because as you've said
nice.
before, like looking at Star Wars and things like those big bombastic space operas and fantasy stories and things like that, they're usually based on events. Each of these points
Hmm.
is usually something happens that reflects this. However,
Yeah.
again, that doesn't map onto every story. It can be something that's very internal, very character driven, in terms of what's actually going on. So these big things aren't. Oh, I can see Matthew in the comments there. It's denouement.
The day anymore. I think I can move it
Is it up?
so you can see it.
So
Oh,
the
still not enough. Hold on. I'll fix it. Go ahead, Gareth.
one of the things that I could map onto this that gives you an idea of how loose it can be as well, and what it's reflecting is Pet Cemetery, which again is one of my favorite stories. Absolutely love it, and because of what it's also about too. And if you look at the kind of line here from beginning to the denouement or the final finish, Pet Cemetery. We have the beginning to kind of set up there that Lewis Creed and his family move into town. He's going to become the new doctor. Um, that's what he does, and that's what he kind of hangs his coat on, more or less, in life, being the best doctor that he can, and obviously his family. The inciting incident I would place in Pet Cemetery. Again, this is one of these things that people could argue over exactly what the inciting incident is that changes things. In the case of this story, I'd probably say it's the death of Church, the cat. And tied into that, because not only is that literally the family structure is starting to change, and this is almost what ripples the entire way through Pet Cemetery, is the entire family being dismantled from the ground up, starting with Church the cat. And because that happens, Lewis gets told about the burial ground, because the neighbor Judd doesn't want to see the young girl Ellie sad about her pet. So refusal of the call mapping into this as well. As Lewis is let in, there's not so much a real sense of refusal from him, but more disbelief. Now he is warned. He understands that there's no return from this. If he goes ahead with Judd's instructions, this is a point of no return. He can't turn back. But his refusal is more or less disbelief. He's just like, yeah, they can bring things back to life. Whatever. I'll go on ahead and do this. When we transition into Act Two, is more or less the results of that. Church returns. He's actually back from the dead, but not the friendly cat that he used to be. Um, it could be argued, but looking at it broken down in a series of events, I do not believe that the next big thing that happens, which I would place as the first major obstacle of Act Two, is the death of Gage, Lewis's son. And a lot of people may argue that that's actually the transition to Act Two. That's the point where everything is thrust forward, but I believe that's more tied in with the first use of the burial ground. So Gage's death and what happens there actually comes afterwards, which could be technically looked at in this standpoint as an obstacle rather than anything more serious pivot point or anything like that. It's just a major obstacle of the story. That obstacle then escalates, literally escalates off the back of that previous obstacle when we come to the next one, because Lewis's family then starts to break apart. He's fighting with his wife's family. His wife Rachel and Ellie go to stay with her parents. Meanwhile, Judd recognizes in Lewis that he's thinking about burying the child, and he's again they have a falling out where he's warning him and telling him stories of things that have happened before because of people doing that, and we learn more about it. So there's a lot of conflict really going on all around Lewis at that point. Around the midpoint, when things are pivoting, is when we really start to see Lewis disintegrating. I would say a lot of stuff that happens in the midpoint here is the friendly ghost, Victor Pascow. He's trying to warn. Well, he's been warning Lewis, but he starts to reach out and try to warn Ellie over on the other side of the country. Meanwhile, all of this, we get a sense that everything is escalating and is about to explode, sort of back at home. The next moving into the next obstacle. Again, this is an obstacle, and this is why I say, with what's going on with Lewis, if in this story, if you imagine he's on his own at home, there's really very little standing in his way of what he wants to do or what he's going to do. Imagine this point where there's something of an obstacle. It's not an event or a literal block that Lewis has to get around. It's dealing with his own conscience and his own grief. And the obstacle, more or less, here is Pascal again turning up to Lewis and saying, "Don't do this. You can't understand what this is going to do." And he's wrestling internally. So it's not a big thing. He doesn't have to get across a car crash or anything that's literally physically in his way. It's all internal. We move into the crisis there, which is more or less disaster. If you refer to this crisis as a disaster, where of course Gage comes back and begins killing people in the neighborhood, kills Judd, kills Rachel when she flies back in, and very quickly from there we have the climax where Lewis takes down Church and Gage and is in the depths of despair, more or less. And this was very much when you get to the point here of the resolution and the denouement, where we usually have rags to riches. This is riches to rags. Literally, everything falls apart in the most tragic way possible, which is why I like Pet Cemetery so much. It's so dark and so grim that when it gets to the resolution, despite everything that has happened, Lewis makes another bad decision to bury his wife. Again, he cannot deal with the grief, and he's saying, "I just waited too long with Gage. It'll work this time. She's just been killed. She's fresh." And yeah, very quickly after that happens, the denouement, Rachel returns, but it's very clear in the finish as we end that she's not herself. So again, just a real, I think I mentioned at the end there of her voice just sounding like it's full of soil and gravel, just the dead rot. She's not come back right, and it just leaves you on that. So very much descent into hell from start to finish, and all of these points in the story are more or less, besides the couple of big incidents that happen to kill Gage and kill Church, are all internal character
Hmm.
battle.
Hmm. Yeah, that's definitely something to consider when not only in horror but other types of fiction like romance or like literary type fiction or things like that, is that you can still have obstacles which sometimes are internal obstacles, people needing to get over something, or you can have incidents which are traumatic events for the person that may not even really be something that's that major uh, in terms of like a physical action or something like that. It could be like a betrayal or something like that, for sure. That's really interesting. Now, the thing about horror writing is that often it's like you said, riches to rags. Often, horror does end tragic, right? Where the hero doesn't only not get what they want, they also don't get what they need, and we as the audience take something as almost a cautionary tale out of it or something like that. So it is a way to tweak the. She still uses the structure, right? But it's definitely not a hero's journey. It's a journey,
Yeah,
but it's a different
yes,
sort of journey.
you're definitely levying a very different message
Yeah,
that is
exactly.
often a cautionary tale or a morality play or something like that, which is don't make these bad decisions. Unlike Lewis Creed, it's better off if you actually process your grief, deal with your problems properly,
Right.
and don't go down that other road.
And I think that's one reason why horror tends to be often rather allegorical, sometimes really well, sometimes not so well, but it
Yeah,
often
yeah.
it often falls that, because sometimes I think people are well too aware of that, and they lean into it so much that it ceases to be a good story anymore. Just like you can lean so heavy into this that it just feels cliche and rote, and it feels like, any dime store fantasy novel from the 1980s, and it's just bland as bland can be. Like, you can definitely overuse it for sure.
And what's next?
All right, so I'm going to go in a completely different direction, and I'm going to talk about romance. I'm going to talk about Pride and Prejudice, which is actually one of my favorite books and movies too. That's actually usually adapted pretty well, and often pretty reliably so. Although the Jane Austen fans may criticize me for that, but I actually think in general it's been a pretty successful work in terms of translation. All right, so but this is definitely one that it's not going to be a bunch of action sequences that are going to meet all these standards, right? This is a different sort of journey. So at the beginning of the story, you have Elizabeth unmarried, and obviously her sister's unmarried, and all being highly pressured by their mother in order to enter marriage. It actually has that iconic first line that every man of good fortune must be one of a wife. So it's this is inevitability. It's the system. It's this inevitability. So you have the inciting incident, which is kind of twofold. You have the characters coming to town. Um, Bingley and Mr. Darcy. But really, the inciting incident beyond even that is when Mr. Darcy insults Elizabeth, and she overhears him at the big dance. Which is like so like it's funny when the director of the new movie was making it, because he filmed it and he was like, I wanted it to be the where they're under the high school bleachers at the prom moment. And it really is kind of like that. They're like they're like there, and they're like overhearing the guys talking trash about them, but it feels very it feels very from a different time almost. It's funny. I guess it's just a universal, right? In that sort of plot. So we have that inciting incident, which of course makes Elizabeth not care very much for Mr. Darcy at all. Now, in terms of refusal of the call, this is a little bit challenging, right? Because what adventure are we asking Elizabeth to involve herself in? Well, ultimately, the big thing that she does to really set the story in motion herself is by refusing Mr. Collins' proposal. Because if she did, obviously the story would be over, because she'd be, off the market, as it were. But she doesn't, and she doesn't want to just force herself into a relationship she's not interested in. She wants to have uh, um, more agency in the decision, and she knows that Mr. Collins is a terrible match for her, so she says no, and that really puts her on this adventure, because it puts her kind of at odds with her mother, and it puts her in a vulnerable situation as the story progresses, because she could be married secure. She's deliberately choosing a life of insecurity for the sake of holding out on a relationship that she cares about, which again, it's a romance novel, so the stakes are different, but they are definitely heavy stakes. So we transition towards Act Two. And this is where Jane's relationship is starting to take off. Mr. Darcy is starting to take off. Different things. The transition is the connection between the two of them a little bit, but particularly that her sister is more or less going to end up with Mr. Bingley until he calls it off, and then that's what really transitions us into the second stage of the story. So, Mr. Bingley breaks it off with her sister, and as a result of that, it gets escalated when Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. And she, of course, says no, because she blames him for the fact that he broke up her sister and Mr. Bingley, and also she just hates him in general. Which leads us to the midpoint, where she ends up getting the letter from Mr. Darcy, which explains why it is that he actually broke them up. He was concerned about whether or not her sister was really interested in Mr. Bingley, or if she was kind of a gold digger, more or less. And it ends up creating the ripple effects, which will ultimately lead Elizabeth to actually appreciate Mr. Darcy as a person. And then we have the obstacle encounter again. Mr. Darcy is basically the obstacle of the story, uh, for the most part, because she doesn't. He wants to marry her. She doesn't want to marry him. That's basically the big conflict of the story. Ultimately, though, she has to realize that she's wrong. So the character ends in a fail because they don't get what they want, which is for her not to be married to him, but yet she does get what she needs, which ultimately is to be married to him. So it's kind of interesting story from that standpoint. She has to have her mind switched because she doesn't realize the person he is. He came across incorrectly. Anyway, so the obstacle encountered escalation is that she meets Mr. Darcy and then she finds out, with Mr. Darcy present, that her sister has run away with Mr. Wickham, which of course is a big scandal, and Mr. Darcy immediately leaves. So she basically feels that, well, everything is lost because she finally realized that Mr. Darcy is somebody who's is somebody she would be interested in having a relationship with. And meanwhile, her sister has ruined her whole family because, in that society, you can't just run off with a guy. That basically messes up the whole family. For marriage, especially from anybody well connected. And so this is about the worst situation she could be in. She's going to be an old spinster and with a dishonorable family. However, there is a climax, which it mostly takes place off page because we don't get to see it happen. But Mr. Darcy actually intervenes. He ends up uh, getting Mr. Wickham and her sister Lydia to be married. At this point, Mr. Bingley proposes to Elizabeth. Mr. Darcy proposes to Elizabeth. She says yes, and basically they ride together in the sunset, more or less. So, very different sort of story. Is Mr. Darcy the antagonist or the relationship character, or is he the MacGuffin? I would say that he is the antagonist. He's not the relationship character. The relationship character is her father, because he's the one that says, um, "I will. Your mother will never speak to you again if you marry Mr. Collins, and I will never speak to you again if you do." So he's kind of that. Or you could argue that Charlotte is the relationship character because she demonstrates the theme of the story, the weight of the decision, right? Because she ends up marrying Mr. Collins because she basically doesn't feel like she has any choice. Marrying the antagonist, interesting. It's actually a very common thing. It's the hate to love romance plot. It's a common one. Um,
It's
it's the
quite
same
frequent in
thing.
Gothic stories as well. That one,
Mm, hate to love.
the marrying the antagonist or being married to the antagonist. I think it's quite prevalent in Crimson Peak, Guillermo del Toro's film, which is a very
Interesting.
sumptuous Gothic take on it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the thing is that I think sometimes people forget that the antagonist, when you think from a structural standpoint, you're talking about the obstacle between what the character, wants. And often it's like a buddy cop movie. It's often, well, the guy just wants to be the hot shot that doesn't work with anybody, and and then he gets this cop sidekick that and he hates him and he spends the whole movie like wanting to get rid of him, and then at the end of the movie he's like, okay, he's not so bad to have around. So essentially it's the same sort of format, right? Most of that now there usually is another character who's the villain, right? But they're not usually the true antagonist in terms of what the character wants, because that they're not the main point. They're not the big obstacle between the main thing that's really driving the character. They're more of a MacGuffin. I will call them the distraction character often. So yeah, it's very very common. Pride and
I just have to
Prejudice and
mention
Zombies. Never
and
seen it.
zombies.
Have you seen it, Gareth?
Put zombies in the mix, and it makes most things better. Generally, yeah. Actually I spent a day on the set of that film just outside London. It was quite fun.
Pride and Prejudice and Zombies.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh wow, that's
Got to
fun.
see the I think it was like the ballroom massacre set, which
Yeah.
kind of sitting on there most of the day, with all the like fake dismembered bodies lying everywhere.
Wow. Yeah. Another good example, since somebody mentioned it about antagonists too, is Finding Nemo. That's the example I like to bring up a lot because in Finding Nemo, Marlin is the protagonist and Nemo is really the antagonist, because what Marlin wants more than anything is for his son to be safe. And the biggest obstacle to that is his son, because his son wants not to be safe. He wants to be able to explore. So ultimately, it's kind of similar to Pride and Prejudice, and at the end of the story, Marlon has to realize his want is wrong and then succumb to the antagonist, and that's what makes the end of the story. So just a different way of handling it. And it just goes to show that you can take these same tools and invert them and come up with satisfying stories for sure. All right. I'm trying to see because we don't have too much time. Maybe I can do another one really quick here.
I think we might have one more.
Let's do. What'd you say? You have one more?
No, no, go
Oh,
ahead.
well,
I
I
think we
want to
can
hear.
do one more.
Oh, oh, okay. We can do one
I'll
more.
let you.
Yeah. Well, I'll do another one that's a little more classic, and that's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. That's more archetypical, maybe easier to track. So, you beginning, this is another rags to riches story. Harry Potter starts out orphaned underneath the stairs. His family treat him awful. You have the inciting incident, which is that he gets his letter to Hogwarts. Um, and he finds out he's a wizard. Now, he doesn't exactly have like a big refusal, like, oh no, I don't want to go to the castle. However, there's a little bit of a hesitation at first. He's like, wait a minute, I'm a wizard. I'm a what? Or what? You get a sense of, again, the gravity of what is going on, the fact that he is choosing to go on this adventure. And it's a children's story to some extent, especially the first book is very, is more like a children's book. It starts to grow. It's a weird series. It goes from basically being middle grade to YA. But but at the first book is written much more middle grade, and so you don't want to take too long before you get into the story, which is the transition to Act 2, which he leaves. He ends up going to Diagon Alley. He ends up going to Hogwarts, and all of this great stuff happens. Now, there's a couple of obstacles that he encounters. He encounters Malfoy, the jerky guy at school, Snape, the jerky professor at school. But the big obstacle that's going to play into the story that they discover fairly early is Fluffy. They take a wrong turn, and the three-headed dog is standing over a door, which is interesting. And that's kind of the escalation. It's that, well, Fluffy is actually guarding something. Oh, and now there's the Sorcerer's Stone that was stolen. Well, that's interesting. So we get to the midpoint, and this is when I would say pretty much in all the Harry Potter books, the midpoint tends to take place basically Halloween. It's like the pivot for all of her books, at least until the seventh. I'm not sure about the seventh. Up until then, though. And so you have the troll in the dungeon, and what this does in this book is it means Harry, Ron, and Hermione are now friends, and they end up also in this time frame, realizing that Voldemort is still alive, which is this obstacle encountered escalation. Yes, he's alive. He's drinking unicorn blood, and the Sorcerer's Stone is in the castle, and he wants it. Oh no! And that creates the crisis, which is they realize, well, Hagrid is not particularly savvy, and he's sharing way too much information, and so Voldemort probably is about to get his hands on the Sorcerer's Stone. So they go through a wonderful climax, facing different uh, challenges and booby traps and all of this elaborate stuff, which is very fun and silly, very Indiana Jonesy. And then they finally realize that Quirrell is has Voldemort on the back of his head, dun dun dun, and he attacks Harry, which creates the resolution where Harry realizes the love of his mother protects him, which is a great bookend to the beginning, right? The bookend of the beginning is that he's not loved at all by his family. He's treated like garbage. And then it's the love of his mother, even from the grave, that manages to save him. And that leads you to the ending, which the Sorcerer's Stone, because it's a series, is not completely closed up because is Voldemort actually gone? Well, no, he's not. He's just in another form. And Harry has to go back to his mean uncle and aunt, and how is that exactly going to work out for next year? So you got it's an interesting story because what she was able to do very cleverly is give Harry Potter a victory, but it's one that he didn't actually earn. It just came from the love of his mother in this situation, which is a really good idea for a first book of a series. Not necessarily would be as good if it was just the end of a story. It might feel a little cheesy, but you wouldn't expect somebody without any training to be able to face the greatest wizard of all time and survive. So the fact that his mother's love does it for the sake of the first book, I think is actually rather brilliant. Is the refusal to call Uncle Vernon stopping him from getting the letters? Yeah, I think that's kind of part of it. There's a resistance there, right? They move, yeah, because he's not allowed to see the letter, and then they move to this island in the middle of the ocean or something. They go to a retreat. Well, not like a retreat. It's like a shelter. I can't even remember exactly where it is, but it's like some crazy place. And then Hagrid still finds him. And then, like I said, once Hagrid meets Harry, Harry gives him a little bit of pushback of, well, wait a minute, this isn't actually right. Are you really sure? Is this possible? And there's just little resistance along the way, which gives you a sense of that weight. Anyway, Gareth.
Awesome. No, that's fine. I'm just sitting here listening to your breakdowns because, as you say, you're going through these stories. They are all ones I have neither read nor watched. So, Aladdin,
Oh,
I
really?
have never sat and watched from start to finish. I believe I watched the first Harry Potter movie in the cinemas, but
Uh-huh.
I don't remember anything about it. I really didn't like it, and I haven't read the books. So yeah,
I mean,
I'm just sitting listening
considering
away.
your dark soul, you certainly wouldn't like such an optimistic story of mother's love conquering all. I can, sure. That sort of stuff just
Well, you
what is it?
never know. You never
Boils
know.
your veins. Nah, I'm just kidding.
Alrighty. Do we have one more, or
Do you
no?
have another one,
Is that
Gareth?
the end? I do
People
not
are
have another
asking
one
you
broken
for,
down.
yeah, people want horror, so maybe we can end on a very dark note because that's the way you like to do things.
I'm thinking, and I'm trying to any of the ones here that are mentioned: Insidious, Conjuring, The Ring. I cannot remember those in their entirety. This is what happens when I'm put on the spot. My brain freezes and I can't remember anything.
Yeah, especially like the 12 points. You might know like the big ones, but yeah, no, it is tough. It is tough. Well, did you have something in mind?
I do not. I'm gonna be super
Oh, okay.
disappointing,
I
but
do.
I do
I have
not.
another one. I have another one. That's fine. I thought you had another one. No worries. The last one that I want to deal with then is Inception. Now, Inception is a very complex plot to unravel. However, even though it's complex, at its base is still all of these points, which is one reason why I think audiences could track it. Even if you ask them to explain it to you and they couldn't, they could at least get the emotional beats and find it to be satisfying. All right, so we begin where Cobb is set up as somebody who extracts information from somebody's subconscious, and then very quickly we realize he's estranged from his family. The inciting incident, he's offered the chance to be involved in a mission, and this is to uh, create inception, which is the idea of implanting somebody else's head inside their own while they're in a dream state and make them think that they actually thought of it in the first place, which apparently is very difficult to do. But if he accomplishes it, he will see his kids again. But yeah, even though he doesn't, he kind of rejects it because he's like, this is not even possible, right? We can't even do this. So you give the audience that weight, that idea that I don't think this is going to be an easy mission to do. So the transition to Act Two happens rather quick. The pacing of this story has a longer act two, I believe, than average. Um, and he gathers his crew together, and he recruits a new dream designer. The obstacle encountered is his wife. His wife is really the antagonist of the story, and she starts to chase after them because Cobb explains to the maker of the dreams that, well, if the dream starts catching on that you're messing with the dream, it starts to behave self-defensively. And so his wife appears and she starts stabbing at her, actually stabs Ariadne. And this creates the escalation, which is okay, getting involved in these dreams is actually starting to lose your sense of reality. And it's also making the audience ask questions. Well, what's up with this wife, right? What, like, who is this character that he's so scared of, and what is going on with that? So the midpoint happens and they start to begin the heist. They start to separate their various ways. And then the heist escalates because, well, they figured out that their mark was actually trained in self-defense against this sort of extraction. And so it's militarized immediately and it dials up to an 11 and more. I mean, there's just so many obstacles that happen. It just escalates further and further and further and further and further until finally they are required well, they miss the kick and they have to wait until the van's going to hit the water, and they have to go into the deepest state, and then it may be that they're going to be lost in limbo. And so all of this happens over the course of the climax and the crisis, and then you have the resolution where Cobb is in limbo and he searches for Sato, and he ends up rescuing them together. But then you have the wonderful denouement where Cobb is back at his house with his kids, and they've previously established that if you're in a dream state, you have a totem, which is a symbol that lets you know you're in a dream state. So he takes out his totem, which is a top, and he spins it, and the story ends without you having full closure as to whether or not he is still in a dream state or if he is not anymore. So that's probably the most quick synopsis of Inception you've ever heard in your life. And if you've never seen the movie before, that probably made zero sense to you whatsoever. But if you have, hopefully you're able to follow along. And you can see that, there's a lot of extra stuff on that plot, right? There's all different kinds of layers and layers and layers, but, those beats are still there underneath. So.
Excellent.
And I actually do I'll put in a little plug for my writer lens about Inception where I go in a little bit further. So check that on the archives. It's good. Trust me. Yes, Gareth?
Alrighty. I think we'll call it there for today. Thank you, everyone.
Ooh, Gaslight. I love that idea. An old movie, Gaslight. Maybe we'll do another round of these, and we'll pick some retro films that Gareth
We could
also hasn't seen.
do a round of classics. Why not?
That's awesome. Yeah, so thank you so much for joining us. Remember, for those of you who maybe caught this on a replay or maybe you're watching it live, make sure you're subscribed, hit the bell, because that way you know about all of our live streams and all of our writing videos that are going to be coming up. Next one will be Tuesday at 1 p.m. So we will see you there. And I'm looking forward to seeing what happens. Go ahead, Gareth.
The usual slot. If you haven't already, as Daniel maybe said, do make sure to subscribe to the channel. You get, I think there's a little bell you can press that makes sure you get notifications when we're going live and when a new video is coming. But on next Tuesday, we will have another What's the Score live. Title to be announced. So we keep up the mystery.
Ooh. It's a little bit of a suspense. It's a cliffhanger for all of you out there. I love it.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.